Thank you so much for everyone who stuck around to the end of the day. Thank you also to Dr. Field and Susanna Sutton. This year it'll be 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and two countries were reunified in a rather short amount of time. Some elements of this reunification were rather easy in that the East Germans, who were formerly communists, just accepted to go into a capitalist economy and democratic system. Other elements were much harder. One of these aspects that I'm focusing on is kind of the convergence of history between the East and the West in two narratives that had been told very differently since the end of the Second World War. So as a museum that was being built during this time, the German Historical Museum really attempts to bring together these two identities and form a new one. No, went one too far. So my initial question was, why does Germany have a historical museum? Looking at other Western European nations, England doesn't have one, France has a very small one, Italy doesn't have one, Sweden's National Museum is an art museum. But when you look at a lot of post-colonial nations, a lot of Eastern European nations, they all do have historical museums. So historical museums really reveal a particular story about the past and indicate to a nation where they should go in the future. So the German Historical Museum functions specifically on how to promote the ideas of democracy and unity within Europe rather than ideals of, or focuses on culture and separation from the rest of Europe. As a brief background about the German Historical Museum, it's located in Berlin, Germany. It was first conceptualized in 1987 by Helmut Kohl, who was then the Chancellor of West Germany. It kind of rose out of this larger debate about a fear of a loss of history and a concern about how to deal with Germany's history. And so then in 1990, the museum had yet to be built. It kind of had some foundations in place, but East Germany and West Germany reunified. And so now you had two very differently governed states coming together. And the key for the museum at that point was to create a common historical past in the museum that fit both with those two ideologies and the new goals of a unified Germany. However, we also have to remember that it was a West German idea, so some of those elements have continued. A brief overview of the exhibit. It starts in 1 BCE, or BC, and then continues around in period rooms, which are designated by the different colors, all the way until 1994. As you can also see, the purple period from 1933 to 1945 only covers 12 years, but is one of the largest, takes up the most floor space. But we'll get back to that in a little bit. The museum clearly states that their goal is to create a new identity based on these core values. And I researched how they did that. So what I looked at was how the museum presented its own exhibits in various forms of print material. One was the online descriptions of the exhibit as a whole in each of the period rooms. Another was another online description of the exhibit tours that are offered by the Education Department for each of those time periods. And then finally, a companion guidebook to the exhibit that gives images of artifacts and also images and pictures that are part of the permanent exhibit. So it became very clear that what they mean by a focus on Germans in a European context is a focus on the political developments in Europe that Germany was a part of or maybe should have been a part of. And this contrasts to any kind of developments of social history or cultural history. And this relates to the idea that they are trying to create a type of national identity that is rooted in being part of a common state rather than a common culture. This is very strongly tied to the idea of nationalism. There's two main types of nationalism, and the one that people normally think of is ethnic or nation-centered nationalism. This is non-voluntary. It's based on the fact that you are part of an ethnic group. You have that same common culture and heritage. Of course, the most extreme example of this is Nazi Germany, where people were identifying just solely based on being part of the Aryan race. Civic or state-centered nationalism kind of goes under the guise of patriotism in most countries. This is voluntary. It's based on your feeling of being part of a political organization or state. So in the United States, for example, we're Americans not because we speak English per se, or because we have the same cultural heritage. It's because we're part of that same political system. So the German Historical Museum really takes a focus on that political side. And a good example of that is these two images that are the kind of flagship images for the exhibit, for the permanent exhibit. They're on all of the print materials that advertise it. On the left-hand side, you have Charlemagne, who unified Europe under the Holy Roman Empire. And then on the right-hand side, you have a propaganda poster for the Marshall Plan, which reunified Europe after World War II and kind of was the beginnings of what today is the European Union. So throughout these online exhibits and the online descriptions and the companion guidebook, there's always this focus on what was going on in each time period politically, and really a kind of a lack of focus on how that might have affected social occurrences, a focus on just all these different political developments. One period in time which doesn't follow that is from 1933 to 1945. If they had focused on what was going on outside of Europe, it probably would have seen as kind of some sort of way to get out of dealing with the Nazi era. So there are some elements that are dedicated to explaining how the Nazis actually rose to power, but then there are a lot that deal with social and cultural history. You have pro-Aryan propaganda posters like you see in the bottom right-hand corner, or anti-Semitic propaganda posters, such as the one in the top left, which portrays a Jewish man as a communist and a beggar and a burden on society. And then you also have, just pictures of the atrocities of the war. This is a photo of people getting on a train to Auschwitz. You have people being shot in ghettos, a scale model in the actual museum of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. So these elements are all trying to show what was going on inside of Germany, how people were being convinced to get behind the movement of the Nazis. And this really, doesn't follow that other model, but it does kind of create this new identity of a Germany that's willing to put its past on display, deal with the Nazi war crimes, and have an open dialogue discussion about it. So the German Historical Museum really calls itself the German Historical Museum, giving itself authority and power to tell a certain narrative of German history. In the end, they really want to go along with what the rest of, what the German political system does by fitting into the norm of Western Europe and not cause any problems like it had in the beginning of the 20th century. They really choose that the best way to portray the museum is through this idea of being unified with Europe, being on the path to a stable democracy, and being included in that European community. Any questions?
You mentioned that this was a primarily West German project at first, so could you talk about how does that affect how they portray the years when East Germany existed?
Well, they do have kind of two separate sections. They have how West Germany progressed and how East Germany progressed. So they do show it, but again, in both sections, they do focus on political developments rather than differences in social or cultural values that each nation had. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What about the economics? Do they go into the economics at all?
They,
of East and West?
Of the East and West, not particularly deeply, at least in these descriptions, that's not what they focus on. And again, this can't be, put onto the whole of the exhibits, which could be very different, could be also very similar. But in terms of how they promote it, they don't really focus on the difference of economic systems.
And do you have any insights into why they might not have?
Other than the idea that they kind of want to focus on going towards a path of democracy, I couldn't really say.
Can I make a confession?
Yeah, sure.
If you think about, there's still a certain amount of East German resentment vis-a-vis the West in terms of equalization of burdens and that kind of thing. And so to play out the way in which Eastern Germany had experienced much more dismantling, having to send things to the Soviet Union, it was stopped, reparations were stopped much earlier in the West, et cetera, so that people have often looked at the two Germanys of, oh, look at how, how great the West Germans were and how productive they were, et cetera, and look how unproductive the East Germans were. And of course that has already created a certain amount of resentment, but it's also not looked at the core of where did they start, what was the starting line. But to remind people of that starting line at a time when there's still a certain amount of tension over the advantages of the West and the disadvantages of the East, that would play up those tensions.
I think they're really trying not to focus on differences or resentments that the West might have of the East
or vice versa.
Or vice versa. And it's also interesting because they do have, two of the kind of cultural things that they talk about are the prefab apartment buildings and a kindergarten, kind of suggesting the, being able to provide free or reduced child care.
In the East.
In the East. That's one thing that they do portray in the East. Anything else, or am I out of
It sounds as though they're really working very hard to make sure that the ethnic notion of being German is not as important.
Right.
This picture of Germany is totally different. Maybe they're worried about that still.
Yes, I think they are. I think that's still a big fear of kind of feeling that you're German because of certain ethnic notions is a big fear, and part of the reason that they downplay that. But at the same time, they don't include any information on kind of migrant groups that have been coming to Germany, such as the Turks. So that's also kind of an interesting notion that they don't try to include that.
That would be ethnic too.
Right, yeah, but say, oh, because you're here, even though many of them don't have citizenship, you're here, you're living in Germany, you can be considered a part of that.
That's very much what you have in France too, that theoretically, everybody's the same, you don't talk about differences.
Mm-hmm.
They're supposed to be invisible.
Yeah.
Just a minor little point as you look at this again. I think you and I talked about the state-centered and nation-centered.
Mm-hmm.
And you got it a little bit confused when you were describing it. State-centered nationalism is where you're really focusing on state borders, a centralized state that already exists, and that, for us, is very common, whereas nation-centered is the stress on the ethnicity, so, and the abstract belonging.
Right.
So one is concrete and one is abstract, and of course it's the abstract one that has had the potential to be defensive and more dangerous and more xenophobic.
Right. Yes?
You mentioned the two narratives, East and West, and I wondered whether there was any attempt at reflecting that, the difference in narrative, or the attempt to work at a common narrative, or if it was just omitted?
No, I mean, in terms of, because the narrative that the East Germans were telling, they had a specific museum for German history, as they called it, where they presented this idea that all of German history was leading up to East Germany becoming a socialist state. And so they really are trying to move away from that narrative, definitely, but I don't think they ever really suggest before then that there is that there was kind of a cause for a division to happen between the East and the West. Yes?
You mentioned the countries that have a historical museum versus the countries that do not. Did you take any conclusion away from why certain countries have and why certain countries do not?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really, you know, post-colonial states and Eastern European states that are kind of, I really see it as trying to assert their national identity, that, you know, we aren't just a former Soviet state, we actually have our own history, and it goes like this. Or, you know, we're not just a former colonial state of Spain, we have a history, and this is it. So I think it's very much kind of trying to assert that. And then of course the other group that does have national histories are totalitarian states, where they're also trying to just limit the interpretations of what history is and try to limit information to people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.